Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of March 24th through April 6th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. Now, it's not technically 1 week; it's 2 weeks. I'm going after the events that happened in the last 2 weeks. I was on vacation. And that is why I was not able to do an update last week, but we are now going to be compensating that with a 2-week special this week. Along with this, because I went on vacation, I am now sick as hell. So if I sneeze or I have to clear my throat, I apologize in advance. I actually, ever since I pressed record here, like I feel a bit better for some reason. Like I was feeling like absolute ass recently. But anyway, let's get right into what's happening. The first thing we're going to talk about is the South and West direction, our directions we've been talking about, that we talked about a lot during the fall of and winter of 2024, and now we are going to be starting here. So the first thing is that one of the biggest operations the Russians did in the last 2 weeks is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Rozlyv. This was a bit of a thorn in Russian side. This allowed the Ukrainians to continue their counterattacks into Constantinople, which we saw in the last video. However, this week we actually had the Russians moving up from the south here, which they've been doing for a long time, and then they did some sort of big attack from Constantinople in the north, and did some sort of double envelopment of Rozlyv, and we actually have multiple Russian flags raising their flags all over this village. And so the conquest of Rozlyv basically helps secure the Russian positions here in Constantinople. We also have basically everything south to the Volga River up to about this gas station. These fields here between Rozlyv and Constantinople have been taken, and so the Ukrainians have fallen back to their main defense in Baratar. They have some, as you can see, I think you can even see it here. Yeah, you could see like a trench network here. But yeah, the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches here and have a lot of very solid positions in Baratar and Oleksandropil, kind of like the same thing as we saw in Andriivka and Constantinople. This is where the Ukrainians have fallen back to, and the fall of Rozlyv gives the Russians a forward position to start attacking Baratar. Now, so a very, very solid gain for the Russians in this direction. My guess is the Russians are going to do some sort of big attack from Andriivka. We actually had geolocated positions of the Russians being in the fields between Lobkove and Andriivka. And just like as they took Andriivka before they took Constantinople, my guess is the Russians are going to try to do a big attack to try to take this village right here. Because if they could secure it, then this would cut off Baratar from the north, and the Russians would be able to start encircling this major village here. But right now, the Ukrainians have good positions here, and the Russians will have to break through either, their positions in here, trying to reach the village of Ordania, and here to cut off Baratar from the west, or in the north from Oleksandropil. So it depends on what the Russians do here, but taking Rozlyv was definitely an essential first step in trying to start breaking the deadlock here, this new defense line for the Ukrainians here. A bit more in the kind of this area near the Kamar area, the south and west direction. The Russians are also making some very good progress. Another village they took in these last 2 weeks, it was the village of Visola. This village right here. This lied on the second line of defense. Most sources are saying the Ukrainians had one line of defense that lied around Buralaska, which the Russians broke, and now the Russians have taken Visola, which laid on the second line of defense, which helped try to prevent the Russians from breaking through to Kamar. With the taking of Visola, the Russians will basically be able to start flanking the Ukrainian trench positions that are around one of the major villages the Russians want to take, which is Shintemko. And so my guess is that the Russians will obviously continue pushing north towards Fordovka. The Ukrainians will probably blow up this bridge, so Kamar is still safe because it's on the other side of this river, so it's going to be very hard for the Russians to clear it. But the Russians could take the village of Fordovka, and at the same time continue pushing westwards from these positions, trying to take these fields and start trying to cut off this road between Volodyanivka and Shintemko. Try to basically cut this road here, and then encircle Shintemko on multiple angles. So the capture of Visola is a very, again, a small stepping stone, but it is something to mention, and it is, again, like Rozlyv, it facilitates continuously Russian advancements in this area. We also have some geolocated footage. The Russians are continuing battling for the village of Lina Polia. We have geolocated footage of the Russians being on the most eastern part of this village. I don't know why the Russians aren't putting a lot of their resources to try to take this village. Taking Vilniapolia, along with their position Novoslyvka, will allow them to have positions in the very south of Shintevko, so they can start having operations to encircle from the south, from the east, and then from the north once they start pushing through these fields from Visola and Vitorovka. So Shintevko is one of the biggest prizes. If the Russians could take Shintevko and Vilniapolia, and if you kind of look up in the big picture here, the main goal for right now, the Russians are going to be trying to take something like this. So if they could take something like this would be a very solid step. This is what the Russians are trying to push for. And then from here, the Russians will then try to probably focus on trying to start encircling the village of Kamar, which is one of the main goals for the Russians in the south and west direction. So, yeah, the battle for Vilniapolia is still ongoing, and we shall see if the Russians could finally take this village here. So yeah, that is the south and west direction, and now we're actually going to be moving towards the Zaporozhye direction, and just more clarifications. The Russians are still pushing here, and this week one of the biggest gains is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Lobkove and have taken not just the southern farms, but also Lobkove is kind of elongated. They also captured this entire village here. So everything. So basically, one of the biggest things is that the Russians have basically pushed Ukrainians back to their pre-2023 counteroffensive lines. As you can know, the Russians had Lobkove and Petrohatki, but they lost that in their offensive, and now the Russians have basically reclaimed what they lost in 2023. But along with this, we also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in Mala Sherbeki and Sherbeki. That being said, I wonder if the Russians are actually here or if it's like a gray zone. But we do have confirmation that Russians are in these villages. So hopefully they're able to use these villages as a forward offensive post here. So we have the Russians have taken their first tactical gains. They have completely secured themselves with the Mali, Sherbeki, Stepova, and Lobkovka. And according to a lot of geolocation, so the Russians have improved their tactical positionings in the west of Orekov very well. However, and right now we have a lot of geolocated footage of the Russians bombing Kamyanka very heavily, and so it looks like one of the main focuses for the Russians now will be on Kamyanka. The Russians will probably try to break through here, try to take these fields here, and then eventually break into Kamyanka here. If the Russians could take Kamyanka, take something like this, this will secure their flank a little bit, and then my next guess is that they're going to start trying to focus on Novoandrivka. If the Russians could do something like this, which is probably the next goal for the Russians, then they'll be in a very solid position. And then from here, the Russians will then have to break through the next Ukrainian line of defense that runs along this blue line here with Stepanhursk, Pavlovka, Novopavlovka. So this is the first step, and then part two, let's change the color here for what the Russians want to do here. Part two is to take something like this. Blue might have not been the best, but something like this here. This is the second goal. So part one is to take this red line, and the second is to take everything under this blue line. If the Russians could take this, they'll be in a very, very solid position to start battling for Orekov. And my guess is the Russians will have to try to activate on the more eastern side of Orekov to try to cut it off from this angle here. But yeah, that is what the Russians are trying to do. They are securing themselves along these villages. They took Lobkovka, and now it looks like the Russians are going to be focused on Kamyanka. But we shall see how the Russians develop their positions in the Zaporozhye direction. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Pokrovsk direction, and this is actually where a lot of interesting things have happened. And this is where, one of the major battles for the counterattacks have been happening between the Ukrainians and Russians. This is where each side tugs and pulls. Each side does not really have initiative, but it's bloody, bloody battles for the Pokrovsk direction. Anyway, let's talk about a little bit more to the south here, because the Russians actually made a very big breakthrough here. The Russians did some sort of major offensive operation that not only, the Russians had their positions around Nadivka and Sabrinia, these villages right here, and then they made a big offensive operation that saw the Russian troops land in these fields to the south of Kotelivka here. So that's actually why we see a bunch of these fields to the south of Kotelivka have been taken. We don't know how much of these fields are actually secured, or if they just got filled up because we saw the Russians there. Let me see how big Kotelivka is. It's not. I don't think it's really a big village anyway. I think it has like 4 buildings. But in any case, they're probably trying to break through here to have a secure their position in the north here before they start battling for these last villages before they reach the Dnieper Oblast here. But anyway, they broke through here, and because of also the Russian breakthrough in the south here, they actually managed to break through and take the village of Bogdanovka. Most sources say that it's just one street, so obviously it was easy to take. But anyway, Bogdanovka is also taken, and because of this, the Russians were able to squeeze and also take the village of Perobrznivka here. So the Russians made a bunch of major progress here in these fields here in the Pokrovsk direction. So everything here was taken in the last 2 weeks. So a lot of major gains here for the Russians. The next thing the Russians are going to probably try to do, if we go, say, change it black to blue, is they're going to probably try to, have a good solid position in the north here by taking Kotelnivka. And from here, they're going to also try to take the village of Tarskoye here and Gorovka here. If they could take at least or at least take Tarskoye. So if they could take Tarskoye and something like this, then they'll be in a very solid position to secure the fields to the north here before the Russians continue their battle for Oleska, which could help them take Baratar. Again, the main purpose here is to reach the village of the town of Novopalovka. A lot of sources basically call this Novopalovka direction. This makes sense. This is where I think the Russians are trying to aim for, because if they could reach Novopalovka, they have a very solid town to secure themselves in, and it has a river. So I've always thought that the Russians would try to, push something like this here. Basically reach this river here, and then this would secure their gains towards Pokrovsk here, and this would also secure the rest of South Donetsk basically. But yeah, so the Russian breakthroughs here through these villages has been very surprising. I thought they would they slow down here. My guess is that the logistics here is pretty awful. There's no really solid roads here. Especially going through these fields, but this is these breakthroughs taking Bogdanovka, Perestovka, getting close to Kotelnivka, Tarskoye is a very solid position. So we shall see how the Russians can develop their positions in these fields here. A bit more to the Pokrovsk direction itself, though, is there's a lot of back and forth, dudes. So one of the biggest things is that the Ukrainians did a counterattack to try to take the village of Solonia, and actually a lot of sources said that the Russians retreated from Solonia. However, then we got GLK confirmation the Russians counterattacked and reestablished control over Solonia. So it does show that the Ukrainians have positions to break into Solonia. This is just a one street village, so it makes sense. Taking Solonia taking this little quarry right here would be catastrophic for the Russians, because then the Russians will probably have to give up their positions in Uspenivka and Novoselivka here, which would very much complicate the Russian positions in the south here. In any case, so the Ukrainians are trying to break the Russians back here. But the Russians are managing to hold on to their gains in the more western part of the Pokrovsk salient. We also have GLA confirmation that the Russians have completely captured the village of Uspenivka, but this village has basically been battled over for about 3 months now, and this village has been burned to the ground. So I don't think there's anything to hold on to here. But we shall see. But in any case, we do have confirmation the Russians are back in Uspenivka, and the Russian MOD has claimed that they have taken Uspenivka. Anyway, so the Russians are holding on to the Ukrainians are counterattacking here, but the Russians are holding on to the west here. More to the north here, we have confirmation the Russians are still in Kotelnivka, especially in this industrial zone. But a lot of sources are saying that the residential area of Kotelnivka is under Ukrainian control. I tend to think this is probably a gray zone. I think Kotelnivka has been razed to the ground. So basically, I don't think anyone controls Kotelnivka, but we do have confirmation the Russians are in the industrial zone, which gives them a position to continue holding on to this railroad here. But the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks, trying to push the Russians completely out of Kotlina. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians give up Kotlina, but the main thing the Russians need to hold on to is the towns of Shintemko and Novotoretska. If they could hold on to this, the Russians are relatively okay. They could give up the salient, and it would simplify their logistics a ton. To make it better, but ideally, they probably should also hold on to Pashana, and then this area right here. I think the Russian push towards here has really radically harmed the logistics, and I think the Russians I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians gave up their positions, Dashna and Kotlina, and just kind of retreated back to maybe Pashana and this area right here. but even if they lost this second line defense, the main thing the Russians really need to hold on to is Shintenko Novotoroska. If they lose one of these villages, it would be extremely catastrophic. That's why it was really interesting that that's why the Ukrainians were attacking Shintenko a ton. Another place where the Russians are also battling back and forth, like Kotna, is the village of Listovka. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this northern strait right here. I tend to think that most of this area below this river is under Russian control, and then that this northern area is kind of in a contested zone. So Listovka is still being battled over. The Ukrainians really want to have a positions here, because if they lose Listovka and Sudzha Yar, then there's nothing. The Ukrainians will have to fall back to Pokrovsk and Minograd itself, and they want to be as close as possible to Russian positions to be able to accumulate troops and attack. But anyway, so the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians made a lot of progress in the fields here, but they're still, in Pokrovsk itself, it's still back and forth. Alrighty, now let us go to the Terets direction, and this is where the Russians are making, they're slowly pushing back the Ukrainians who used to be on the offensive in the Terets direction, and now the Russians are. One of the biggest surprises that the Russians pulled on us was that the Russians made a major attack in these villages in this direction here. They actually attacked from positions here and managed to completely capture the village of Pantelemonovka here. And because they were able to capture this village, they also managed to push the Ukrainians away from Oleksandropil here. So these two villages have completely fallen to the Russians, and so this entire area was captured by the Russians here. So that's a very big gain for the Russians. I think the Ukrainians, in these, positions here are, they understand that the Russians are trying to, encircle this area here. So, I understand that the Ukrainians probably gave up this without a fight. One thing where the Russians are also trying to push now is down the village of Sukha-Balka. This is a very fortified stronghold. It has a bunch of high-rise buildings, as we can see, and has some warehouses. So this is a very big area where the Russians could hold on to, or where the Ukrainians could hold on to, and I don't think the Ukrainians are going to give up this without a fight. But I could definitely see the Russians accumulating forces in New York and doing a major offensive to try to take this village. If the Russians could take Sukha-Balka, they'll have a very, they'll secure their flank here in New York a lot better. So yeah, the Russians are pushing through here. We also have increased drone activity in Kotelna and Mykolaievka here. So it looks like the Russians are now putting the pressure on this, instead of trying to encircle it, which looks like it's being halted, the Russians are just trying to attack it directly. So, yeah, we'll see how the Russians, develop their offensive here. So, yeah, they're improving their positions here. In Terets itself, though, most sources are saying that the village of Novospatsky and Shyerobrinka has been completely recaptured by the Ukrainians. So these two villages, which the Russians really need to take, are now under complete Ukrainian control. And yeah, so it's definitely a very big setback, because if the Russians could take Novospatsky and Shyerobrinka, they could secure their positions in Terets a lot better. But it's for some reason it's a very big. It's very complicated for the Russians to take these two villages. So the Ukrainians are still in control of these two villages. But in Terets itself, the Russians are actually making a lot more progress. Like before, we talked about how the Ukrainians were counterattacking and prevented the recapture of Terets by the Russians. Well, basically, in the last 2 weeks, the Russians are pushing back. Most sources are saying that all of the Zabalka district is completely back under Russian control. This makes sense because the Russians are still in the village of Leninivka and in these villages. So basically, if the Ukrainians try to push here, they could be surrounded. So they basically fell back to Shyerobrinka and Novospatsky. The Russians are also pushing the Ukrainians out from this northern residential area, specifically around the stadium and the central thing, which is where they need to push out. I still think that this residential area is still in this massive gray zone. I don't think anyone controls here. Probably here as well. I don't think there's, in this northern area, I don't think there's people here. I think, as I mentioned, the Russians are probably only in this position behind this red line. However, one thing we do have more and more confirmation on is that the Russians have complete control over the Krymsky mine. This mining complex has given them very solid positions if they could hold it, and then holding onto this mine will allow them to push the Ukrainians out from this northern residential area. So we have more confirmation of that, and yeah, so the situation in Terezk is now turning in Russian favor. They are slowly pushing Ukrainians out of Terezk, and we see them now activating in these fields between Terezk and the Minigrad direction here. So yeah, we shall see how the Russians develop here. It looks like the Russians are also trying to start pushing towards in these fields here, because if they could take the village of Russian sources say they already took Dachna, but I thought that was bullshit. We don't have any. We have not got any video evidence of that yet. We do have some evidence that the Russians have crossed the Seversky Donetsk Canal and have positions on the other side. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, continue to try. If they could take Dolivka and Dachna, take these fields here, then this could, very much complicate, Ukrainian positions to continue attacking Terezk. Because the way they could completely secure Terezk is by pushing the Ukrainians back. And in order to do that, they have to take Dolivka, Dachna, they have to take Sherobrenka, Novospassky, they have to get Kalina Bulka, Katerinovka. Basically, what the Russians have to do is take everything here. If they could take this, then they could actually secure Terezk. But before they do that, the Ukrainians will keep doing counterattacks. Alright, now we're going to go to the Chasiv Yar direction, and actually I'm going to combine this with the Seversk direction, because in the last 2 weeks we actually haven't had any really big any map changes in these two directions here, but there is some things to be talked about here. So the biggest thing in Chasiv Yar is that we've seen a super duper big increase in Russian attacks on Ukrainian positions on the STD line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkovka, Konstantinovka, and Terezk. And the reason for that is because, according to most sources, the Ukrainians are actually accumulating a huge force in this area. Apparently, the main reason here is they want to push the Russians completely from Chasiv Yar and onto the other side of the Seversky Donetsk Canal. They really don't want the Russians to secure Chasiv Yar. The Russians have, there's been, and because of this, it looks like the Russians are hunkering down. But if the Ukrainians come in force, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, have to fall back from this northern residential area. If the Russians have to give up their positions in the south here. As long as the Russians could try to hold on to their the refractory plant, the factory here, and all that, then have some positions here, that'd be good. But I think the Ukrainians are trying to assemble forces to push Russia completely out of from Chasiv Yar and onto the other side of the canal here, which would be a very big setback. So the Russians are seeing this; they're bombing. So I think for the summer offensive, the Ukrainians are probably one of the things the Ukrainians want to focus on is Chasiv Yar. So, but we shall see. I still don't know why the Russians have not been able to clear this central part. Like, how hard can it be? Like, how many people are actually there? And then in the Seversk direction, same thing. This is actually where the Russians are actually making a bit more progress. Accordingly, they're like doing step by step. They're trying to clear this what they call the Bilokhorovka hill. So this is a elevation. This is where you get the dominant height here. If the Russians could take everything in these hills, they could take Grigorivka, they could take Verkhovnyanska, and then they could basically reach the outskirts of Seversk. But they have to take these fields here, and the Russians are making slow progress day by day here. So there's been no changes to show that, but this is where the Russians are trying to focus on the Seversk direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Liman direction, and this is where a lot of interesting things have happened. Looks like the Russians are putting a lot of focus on Liman, and a lot of sources are saying that, even the Ukrainians are saying that one of the areas the Russians want to focus on for the summer is the Liman direction. It looks like the Russians are already activating here. And what I mean by that is that the Russians have made massive progress to the northwest of Ivanovka and Novolubivka, and to give you an extent of how much they've taken, these are all the fields they took in the last 2 weeks. So a lot of major progress here, and they have reached the outskirts of the village of Nova and Katerinovka. In fact, some sources are saying the Russians actually have a foothold in Nova. If they could take Nova and Katerinovka, this will give them a very solid position to, and then they also have to take the village of Kolodosovovska here. So they have to really take this village, because right now all they have, and this bridgehead has no, they have no really big towns. They have like 2 small little villages here, which has like 1 street basically. So there's not much they could hold on to, but if they could take Novi, which as you can see, Novi is a very, very big village, which they could secure themselves in, and then if they could take Kolodosovsky here, which is another big village, then they could actually have a very solid position to accumulate forces in this other side of the Zhirobets River. So the Russian push here is trying to take something like this here. If they could take Nova and Kolodosivka, which is what the Russians are trying to focus on, then they could have a very solid bridgehead to then expand out of. And I don't know where they'll. Maybe they'll start focusing on Liman. Maybe at this point they'll try to push towards, these villages to the north of Liman to cut it off from the north. Probably also try to push down towards Toretska and Zarishnia here. But we shall see what the Russians do. But they really need to secure their positions on this bridgehead here. So, yeah, if they could take Nova, which they look like they already entered, and if they could then, once they take Nova, they could then encircle Kolonovsky from the north, and then attack it from multiple angles and take it as well. So the battle for Novi and Kolonovsky is ongoing, or is about to start. And if the Russians could take these two villages, then they'll have a very solid position on this Zhirobets River here. Pushing through all these fields here has been a lot of rapid progress. I was not expecting that in the Liman direction, but yeah. Once they take this, the Russians might also push northwards here. They might, because they want to liberate all the Luhansk Oblast. So from this point, the Russians might push north here, try to take Nova Mikhailovka here, and then try to take these fields here, and then unite the Makivka bridgehead with the Ivanovka bridgehead, and then from here, then take the village of Grigivka here and take the rest of these fields in Luhansk Oblast. So the main goal here is to take something like this, and so that is the Liman direction. A lot of very interesting gains happening here. So we shall see what if the Russians could take Novi and Kolodyiska here. Alrighty, now in the more in the Liman direction, and then more in the Borova area. The Ukrainians, we talked about how they took back the village of Nadivka, but there's been back and forth. We see clashes over this small village. This village probably got wiped off the face of the earth, but yeah, there's battles for this village. And then also, a lot of sources are saying that the Ukrainians have basically cleared the Russians out from around Zeleny Hall, so their positions to the east of Borova are more secure. I also would probably be under the impression that the village of Koponivka and Stepova are either in the gray zone or in some sort of maybe even under Ukrainian control. Because if the Russians are actually here, then the Ukrainians would not been able to counterattack here because they would have to take these two villages to secure their flank a little bit. So I do think these two villages are more in the gray zone, and the Russians are probably the main Russian positions are in Stemaktovka and Andriivka, like this area right here, and then Russian positions in Lazova and in the Kharkov region here are more vague, I should say. Anyway, now let us go to the Kupiansk direction, and this is where a lot of major gains are happening for the Russians. The Russians are making rapid progress in creating their Dorishnia bridgehead. One of the biggest things is that the Russians are trying to create a land bridge to their Dorishnia bridge. So right now, the Dorishnia bridgehead is supplied by pontoon bridges across the Oska River, which could be targeted by Ukrainian forces. That being said, so what the Russians are trying to do is create a land bridge. As you can see, the Russians have position. They have the Russia proper here, which they could supply troops in, but then. What they want to do is basically create a large bridgehead here, which will allow them to have a land connection to Dorishnia. And what they're doing here is by attacking the northern sector. This is where the Russians are focusing on. So one of the biggest things is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Krasnopereshi here. And the Russians have also taken all these fields around Krasnopereshny here. So this entire area has been captured by the Russians. So that's a lot of massive gains for the Russians in Kharkov. I still think the Russians are still in control of Filotovka. Only the Ukrainians say they took it back, but we have geologic confirmation of the Ukrainians bombing the Russians here, so they still have positions in this village. But they took the village of Krasnopereshi. They also have improved their positions around Topoliny, are basically trying to take these fields to the west, or the east of Kamyanka. And one of the biggest things is the Russians are trying to take one of the last prizes is Kamyanka. And we actually have geolocated confirmation the Russians are actually in the southern part of this town. And we have geolocated confirmation the Russians have captured the southern part of Kamyanka. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue pushing the Ukrainians out of Kamyanka. As we can see, the Russians are trying to take, the fields to the west of it. I wouldn't be surprised. The Russians are also improving their positions to the east of it, trying to take these hills here. So the Russians could take, the hills here. The Russians are also pushing them out of Kamyanka. And then the main goal here is to then, take, this area here. And then once they take, once they take Kamyanka, as you can see here, then they'll have roads that lead into Russia proper, and then they could use these roads to supply their Dorishnya bridgehead. So it goes through Topany, then Kamyanka, and then it goes to through here to Dorishnya. So then they have a land bridge which cannot be broken unless the Ukrainians cut it. But there's not a magic bullet like blowing up a pontoon bridge, for example. Anyway, so once the Russians take Kamyanka, this will secure their Kupiansk bridgehead. Yeah, we shall see how the Russians develop that. And then also in the southern direction here, the Russians are now battling for the village of Kindercherivska and Mala Shapkivka here. There's a lot of geolocated confirmation that the Russians are in the most northern outskirts of this town here. A lot of sources are saying the village has now been contested, but we don't have any confirmation the Russians have taken it. But this is definitely a town that the Russians have to take. If they can take Kindercherivka, this will allow them to reach cut off one of the major fortifications to the north of Kupiansk. So if the Russians could take something like this, then they'll cut off one of the main roads that supply the Kupiansk garrison here. So yeah, the battle for these villages are ongoing. We shall see if the Russians could capture them. And it looks like the Russians are not only trying to create their land bridge in the north here, they're also trying to take these villages to the north of Kupiansk. And then, from there, they could then start encircling Kupiansk, which is one of the major goals for the Russians in this direction here. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. Now let us go to the Sumy direction, which is what I'm going to be calling this now, the Sumy-Kursk direction. And this is where the Russians are also making some progress, but also the Ukrainians are making some progress. But let's talk about the Ukrainian incursion that happened in Belgorod here. So we still have the confirmation that the Ukrainians are still in Popovka and Demyanovka, but we also have confirmation that the Russians are there. So these two villages are being fought over. Neither side controls them, but the Ukrainians are trying to take these two villages, because if they could take say everything like this, right? If they could take these two villages, this would thwart the Russian plans to take the town of Myropilya, because if they could take Myropilya, this will because as you can see, the Ukrainians have this pimple here, so the Russians could take Myropilya and then secure themselves here. So the Ukrainians did this counterattack, I believe, to try to alleviate this pimple, and so the front line could go something like this. If they could, so the Ukrainians want the front line to go something like this. They want to take some parts of Belgorod Oblast so that Myropilya is more secure. But they still have not completely captured Popovka or Demyanovka. They're battling for it, but there's fierce battles going on here still. Speaking of that, that's why the Ukrainians are having such a tough time trying to hold on to the village of Guino here. We actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags, at least in the northern part here. It seems like the Ukrainians are still in the southern part of this village, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians completely capture this village soon. The reason why the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to Guino for so long is because if the Russians could take Guino, right? Then the Russians will continue pushing towards the village of Gornonol here. And then, if they reach Gornol, then they'll be one step closer to encircling Myropilya. So the Ukrainians really want to hold on to this town here of Myropilya. And that's why they're attacking here. That's why they're holding on to Guino so long. But we see the Russians, pushing the Ukrainians back from their incursion and slowly taking the village of Guino here. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take this village very soon. And then more in the Sumy direction here, this is where the Russians are making rapid progress. One of the biggest things is the Russians have completely captured the village of Basovka. They have completely captured this village, and this is unlike the village of Nonivka here. This actually has a lot of buildings here that the Russians could use to secure themselves in. So the Russians could hold on to Basovka. This would secure their positions to start clearing out the rest of Kursk Oblast. So this week speaking of that, the Russians have completely captured the Kursk-Sumy border crossing, this area right here. And the only thing left is to take the village of Oleshna here, which I don't know why the Russians are not taking it, but they have taken basically all the fields that are in front of it. And so, I believe the Russians will take this village back, because now that they've taken Basovka and secure themselves in these fields, these tree lines in the south, they could take Oleshna. And then, the Ukrainians are going to fall back to their main defense line here, which is around the village of Yunatovka here. So this is where the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to. But I do think the Russians are going to try to push to at least to here, and then, probably stop for now at least. But yeah, Basovka has been taken. The Russians have taken the border crossing here, and they're about to take the village of Oleshna. And then in Sumy itself, we have a few more updates here. The Russians have completely captured the village of Vasilivka here. This makes sense. These are probably abandoned border towns. We also have most sources are saying the Russians have taken the village of Volodymyivka here. So as you can see, the Russians are trying to enter in multiple angles here, and the main goal here, I believe, is to probably take everything to the north of this red line, and then from here, we'll see what the Russians try to do. Maybe they pause, but we talked about what the Russian plans are for Sumy. But I do think that they'll probably try to take the village of Yanovka, but that will be a very big battle. The Ukrainians really don't want to give up this village here, but I do think the Russians will try to secure their flanks here by taking a few of these border villages here. But we shall see what the Russians do from here. But yeah, the Russians are entering. They took the village of Zorovka, Vasilivka. They have entered the village of Volodymyivka. So yeah, the Russians are improving their position there. So we shall see what happens after that. And yeah, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed my weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update to tell you guys what's happening on the front lines. Be sure to, if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.